The Way of the Bodhisattva, Chapter 5, Vigilant Introspection. Say that this chapter, as well as the previous chapter on carefulness, both relate to the paramita of discipline as the second paramita in the Bodhisattva path. This is discipline in terms of our body, speech, and mind. In other words, how we speak.
Excuse me, Michael. That's right. Barry, are you recording?
I have not co-hosted, so I can't.
You are now.
Yes, okay.
Thank you.
There we go.
Sorry,
So, okay. So it applies to discipline in terms of our body, speech, and mind, how we act, how we speak, how we relate to our mind. This is sometimes translated as conduct, sometimes translated as ethical conduct, sometimes even as morality. And it's hard to say how much is in the original language and how much is the predilection of the different translators. But in any case, it's Shila, Shila in Sanskrit, Sultram in Tibetan. But the main point here is taming the mind. This is what we learned was so important in the previous chapter on carefulness, that we need to tame our mind because otherwise we're totally at the mercy of the kleshas, passion, aggression, and ignorance. And as we heard about last week, these present significant harm to us and to others. And so we want to be able to tame our mind so that we're not at the mercy of the kleshas. Trungpa Rinpoche and other teachers will say that discipline involves knowing what to accept and what to reject, sometimes phrased as what to adopt and what to avoid. And I'm going to take a moment here just to explain how this can seem contradictory, but really isn't. And the best explanation for this, by the way, is in the book that we read previous to this class, Mind at Ease by Tralag Rinpoche. So if you have time and you'd like to do some extra reading, reread pages 147 to 150, where he talks about the context of different instructions under different circumstances. The point here is that in meditation practice, we practice mental non-engagement. And the instruction, for instance, will say things like that there are no good thoughts, no bad thoughts, nothing rejected, nothing encouraged or grasped. And that this is important for many different reasons in terms of how we practice meditation. Even on the Hinayana foundational level, the idea behind shamatha is absence of struggle, development of peace, calm abiding. And the reason for that is that when we're able to dwell in peace, the mind settles and its natural clarity comes out. The usual typical metaphor for that is like sediment and water. And as long as we stir the sediment up, the water remains cloudy. But if we're able to stop stirring the water, then the sediment settles and the natural clarity of water just becomes apparent. And in the same way, when we keep our minds agitated, chasing after certain thoughts, trying to cultivate some, following others, and trying to push away or reject others, that just keeps the mind agitated and obscured. So in the practice of meditation, it's important to be able to relax that effort, relax that struggle, be able to not engage in any of that kind of activity. And when we do this, the clarity of mind expresses itself as vipassana. Trungpa Rinpoche makes it very clear repeatedly in his teaching that shamatha leads to vipassana. Vipassana ultimately leads to prajna. So this is why in the context of meditation practice, it's important to be able to relax the mind and have this attitude that there are no good thoughts to cultivate, no bad thoughts to push away. That we just try to do our best to simply be aware and rest in awareness without engaging in that kind of struggle. It's also important on a Mahayana level that in terms of making friends with ourselves, the more that we're able to relate to our experience just as it is, without falling into judgment of ourselves and judgment of our experience. The more we're simply being just as we are in the moment, the more open we are to ourselves, and the more open ultimately we'll be with the world around us as well, rather than reacting with judgments and all the reactivity and impulsivity that comes out of that. But as Tralug Rinpoche says, in action, so in meditation, we're not involved in any other activity. But in post-meditation, it is important that we know what to accept and what to reject. In a sense, it's also important in meditation that we're not engaging with the normal activity of mind in terms of good and bad, better and worse, and so on. But even more so in post-meditation, it's really important to understand what kinds of actions, what kind of activities lead to harm to ourselves and others, and what leads to liberation and freedom for ourselves. And the idea here is with this is that although there aren't any kind of reactive shoulds or should nots, if we're able to relate to simply rest in awareness, that we're just able to instead be present and act in accordance with situations just as they are. And this could be very simple. I mean, it's not a should or shouldn't in the sense of judgment. It's more in the sense of having some idea of what makes sense, what leads to what, or what's appropriate to a situation. I should not touch a hot stove. I should take an umbrella when it's raining. Of course, it becomes a lot less clear in activity when we're in situations where we have to do things like set boundaries on someone's behavior, or learn to say no or stop or something like that. And for that reason, there's a path, and we learn from our mistakes one way or the other by staying in awareness and observing what happens when we do one thing or the other. So basically, the importance of discipline is to be able to stay awake, stay present, stay aware. Another word for this is non-distraction. The line in the Kagyu lineage chant that we supplicate before each meditation session: awareness is the body of meditation as is taught. Whatever arises is fresh, the essence of realization. To this meditator who rests simply without altering it, which again is just being able to just let things be as they are without engaging in good or bad. Grant your blessings so that my meditation is free from conception. Sometimes that is translated not as awareness is the body of meditation, but non-distraction is the body of meditation. But what are we not distracted from? It's awareness. So it's essentially saying the same thing, but just really emphasizing the shamatha quality of not being distracted and being able to stay in awareness. So with that, I think we can begin looking at the text. And we'll have my first test of my screen share. Is there someone who would like to read just the first verse? You can put your hands up or hit the reaction button. Get some readers for tonight. Carolyn?
Yep. Vigilant introspection. Those who wish to keep the trainings must with perfect self-possession guard their minds. Without this guard upon the mind, the trainings cannot be preserved.
Okay. So with the beginning of every chapter, the first verse or the first few verses really talk about why whatever issue it is that's being discussed, why it's so important. And this is the important thing about developing discipline. As we'll see as we go along, without discipline, without this ability to remain undistracted, without the ability to remain in awareness, none of the trainings will really work for us, or we won't be able to engage the trainings. And that is something that's an issue that will come up again and again as we go through this chapter. So the method for taming the mind is developing our ability to rest in awareness. And this primarily involves shamatha, calm abiding meditation. And in shamatha, usually there's an object of meditation. Most commonly we work with the breath, but it could be anything. I was thinking that some people have cats and dogs that come across as they're meditating, and the cat or dog could bring you back as well as the breath if we relate to it properly. But whatever the object, the instruction is the same. When we see that mind's wandered, we bring it back to the present. gently without harshness or judgment. Sometimes this meditation, the shamatha meditation, is called recollection, but it's not recollection in the sense of looking into the distant past. It's recollection of what we're doing in the moment. It's recollecting, remembering to come back, remembering to stay present. The trainings that are referred to in this first verse refer both to the three disciplines of the three types of discipline that are that fall under discipline paramita, which are, first of all, not harming others, secondly, gathering virtue, and third, benefiting others. But also in a broader sense, it refers to all the paramitas, that a wild mind, an untamed mind, cannot develop because there's no stability. And Pema in her book points out that it takes time, and takes time to develop stability of mind, which is why regular practice is important. But we have to be aware of the contents of our mind, because no one else can do this for us. And the point is not to fall into distraction, but rather to guard the mind through mindfulness and vigilant introspection. So starting with verse 2, all right, let's see how well I can do the screen share piece. Starting with verse 2, verses 2 through 7 fall under the heading in Kunzang Palden's commentary of helping us realize that all harm comes from the mind. So, Trip, could you read verse 2?
Yes. Wandering where it will, the elephant of mind will bring us down to torment in the hell of unrelenting pain. No worldly beast, however wild and crazed, could bring upon us such calamities.
So the point here is how much harm the untamed mind can bring to us. It was interesting reading in the Kunzang Palden's commentary that apparently in India, elephants in ancient times were used for military purposes. They were literally maddened with alcohol and then let loose, and could actually bring a whole town or village to ruin. So it's a really powerful beast. It can do just tremendous harm. But Shantideva's point is, even with all of that, so to ancient Indian, you couldn't imagine something more powerful than an elephant. But his point is that's nothing compared to what an untamed mind can do, that it can literally drag us to hell. But we don't even have to think about, imagine a hell. We can just look at our own lives and think about how the behavior that arises from passion, aggression, and ignorance when we're really blind has caused suffering in our lives, caused us to cause suffering for others. And we could just think of hell either as a real thing, or we could just think of it as a metaphor, a symbol for the dire consequences of having an untamed mind. Steve, could you read verse 3?
If with mindfulness as rope, the elephant of mind is tethered all around, our fears will come to nothing. Every virtue drop into our hands.
Okay, so this is the other side of the coin, that through mindfulness meditation, through practice of shamatha vipassana, we can allow the mind to settle. We can stay put. And the metaphor given here is mindfulness is rope that holds the elephant of mind so that it stays in one place. We stay present. We stay in awareness so that we can tame the mind. And if we can do this, Shantideva says, our fear will come to nothing. I'm just going to read a piece from, again, Kunzang Palden's commentary on these three verses, actually. And what he says is that the elephant of mind, which can be driven wild by desire, is tethered to the rope of mindfulness, so that it remains aware of the principle of adopting and rejecting with regard to actions of body, speech, and mind. And if it is bound to the post of correct mental behavior and prevented from following past experience, inviting future thoughts, and straying to the object and conditions of the present, all fears and dangers of this life and future lives will be brought to nothing. So in that commentary, he's talking both about discipline and formal meditation practice, where we don't follow thoughts of the past, thoughts of the future, and we don't become absorbed in present thinking either. As well as in post-meditation activity, our life outside of formal meditation practice, where we're aware of what to accept and what to reject, what to adopt and what to avoid. This will become clearer and clearer because Shantideva is going to drive this point home over and over again. Verses 4 through 8 continue with this theme of how all harm comes from the mind and how by taming the mind we can actually free ourselves from harm. Shini, would you like to read verses 4 through 8?
Sure. Tigers, lions, elephants, and bears, snakes in every hostile fall, those who guard the prisoners in hell, ghosts and ghouls and every evil wraith. By simple binding of this mind alone, all these things are likewise bound. By simple taming of this mind alone, all these things are likewise tamed. For all anxiety and fear and pain in boundless quantity, their source and wellspring is the mind itself, as he who spoke the truth declared. The hellish instruments to torture living beings, who invented them for such intent? Who has forged this burning iron ground? Whence have all these demon women sprung? All are but the offspring of the sinful mind. This the mighty sage has said. Throughout the triple world, therefore, there is no greater bane than mind itself.
Okay, so again, the key point in these verses that we just read is that all harm derives from the mind and from our confusion, our ignorance. The line about demon women, I read the footnote and also Pema's commentary. The point is, first of all, to remember that Shantideva is speaking to an audience of monks. So it's he's speaking to monks who've taken various vows of celibacy and so on. And really what he's talking about here is the tendency to project our desire onto things and then feel drawn to them and not realize that, and to give in, to not to externalize our own motivations in a way. But the basic point is to see that it all comes from mind, that all this struggle, all this drama develops from mind. And if we're able to arrest in awareness, this is the other point that he's making, if we're able to actually remain in awareness, then these emotions become workable. They lose their power. Without awareness, we identify with the kleshas. We get lost in the kleshas, and then again, bring harm to ourselves and others. Perhaps if he'd been speaking to an audience of nuns, maybe he would have said demon man. But in any case, think of these verses, think of that in particular as the suffering caused by blind passion. Okay, with verses 9 through 16, he makes another point, which is that all virtue comes from the mind. Pema says about these next set of verses, 9 through 16, that they relate to how the untamed, confused mind is transformed through the paramitas, starting with generosity, and specifically how specific different states of mind are transformed into Bodhisattva activity. But whatever the case is, in each instance, we have to work with the mind and undercut attachments and self-fixation. So again, we're back to how being non-distracted helps us to make progress in the trainings. So let's see. Sarah, could you read verses 9 and 10?
If transcendent giving is to dissipate the poverty of beings, in what way, since the poor are always with us, have former Buddhas practiced it? Transcendent giving, so the teachings say, consists in the intention to bestow on every being all one owns, together with the fruits of such a gift. It is indeed a matter of the mind itself.
Okay, so the point that he's making here, transcendent giving, is again the first paramita, the paramita of generosity. And he asks in the beginning, if transcendent giving is to dissipate the poverty of beings, what can we do since the poor are always with us? How have former Buddhas practiced this? And in fact, you'll see with each, we'll be going through all of the paramitas in these verses. And in each one, he says in the beginning how if we think of the paramitas and we think of the vastness of suffering in the world, what is it exactly that we're supposed to do? And what we're supposed to do with each one is to be able to develop a mind that's capable of practicing generosity, discipline, and so on. So the point here is that in these verses, beginning with, that begin with the paramita of generosity, that it's impossible to end all poverty for any one of us, but the generosity derives from the mind, and that the wish, what we want to develop, is the wish to end the poverty of beings, any kind, all kinds of poverty, material, spiritual, whatever. As Pema says, to develop generosity, we have to deal with poverty mentality, poverty mind. We have to be able to let go of attachment and clinging, the feeling that we're so desperate that we can't let go of anything at all. And she tells a story about a beggar who approached the Buddha and asked the Buddha for food for her and her family. And the Buddha promised food for her and her family every day, but on the condition that she had to say, "No, I do not need this," and wait a few minutes before receiving the food. And apparently she couldn't do that. It notes that Buddha gave her the food anyway, but she never returned. So the point, what we're being asked to develop is a mind that can open up and let go, that can express, that can develop the capacity for giving, the capacity for opening up, the capacity to simply being available. Kunzang Palden says the point of this verse is that we have to train ourselves in open-handedness, the genuine intention to give to all sentient beings. Okay, so verse 11 relates to the paramita of discipline itself. And in particular, in this verse, it talks about the discipline, the first type of discipline, which is not harming. So let me see. Steve, could you read verse 10? No, sorry, verse 11.
Where could beings, fishes, and the rest be placed to keep them safe from being killed? Next slide.
Yep.
Deciding to refrain from every harmful act is said to be transcendent discipline.
Okay. So the point that he's making here again is that we can't possibly protect all beings, although we might wish to. But what we can do is develop a mind that determines never to harm others, deciding to refrain from every harmful act. That this is transcendent discipline. That we have to start with ourselves. We have to make the decision to refrain from harming from others. Verses 12 through 14 relate to the paramita of patience, which is the next chapter, chapter 6. And there's actually quite a bit on patience, but the basic idea of patience is overcoming anger, overcoming aggression. So again, we're working to develop a mind that's capable of letting go of reactive aggression. Let's see, Judith, could you read verses 12 through 14?
Harmful beings are everywhere like space itself. Impossible it is that all should be suppressed. But let this angry mind alone be overthrown, and it's as though all foes had been subdued. To cover all the earth with sheets of leather, where could such amounts of skin be found? But with the leather soles of just my shoes, it is as though I cover all the earth. And thus the outer course of things I myself cannot restrain, but let me just restrain my mind, and what is left to be restrained.
Okay, so again, as with the other, the previous paramitas, we're again have to face the fact that the outer course of things we cannot ourselves restrain. But we can work with our minds. We can work with training ourselves not to give in to wild, blind aggression. And again, that will be the main theme of chapter 6 when we come to that. But for right now, there's another message in this, which is that we can look forever to try to make a perfect world around us. And in fact, that's conventionally what most people do, try to create ideal circumstances. But the point is that it's impossible to do that. That first of all, there's pain and difficulty and struggle in trying to accomplish that. And secondly, it's impermanent. Things fall apart. And what we're trying to do is literally what he talks about in verse 13, which Pema says is maybe one of the most famous verses in this text, that how could we possibly cover all of the earth with sheets of leather? We couldn't, but with the leather soles of just my shoes, it's though I cover all the earth. And what he's speaking about there metaphorically is that by working with our mind, by taming the mind, then whatever we meet, whatever we encounter becomes workable. We don't have to give in to just reactive, impulsive behavior, but can actually be open and responsive to things. And again, this is the entire topic of chapter 6, patience, how to work with aggression and anger. Verse 15 relates to the paramita of exertion or enthusiasm. So, Trip, would you like to read again?
A clear intent can fructify and bring us birth in such as Brahma's realm. The acts of body and of speech are less. They do not generate a like result.
So here we're talking about, again, the paramita of exertion or enthusiasm. And the point thing here is that a joyful mind develops by working, benefiting others. There is actually a fairly famous verse in the chapter on exertion that I should have looked up because I'm going to have to paraphrase, but the basic idea is all the suffering comes from looking out for oneself. All the joy in the world comes from working for the benefit of others. And it's this joyfulness and the energy that comes from being able to truly benefit others. That's the essence of the exertion paramita. Chapter 16 relates to the paramita of meditation. Let's see, Philip, could you read chapter 16? 16.
Recitations and austerities, long though they may prove to be, if practiced with distracted mind, are futile. So the knower of reality has said.
Yeah. All right, so the point here is that if we remain distracted, we could do all kinds of recitations, practice all kinds of austerities, that if they're done with a distracted mind, they really won't produce much of a result. So again, the importance of being able to stay settled, to stay awake, to be able to stay in awareness is what makes the paramita of meditation practice possible. Again, this goes right back to the beginning with the whole idea that without vigilant introspection, knowing what's in our minds and being able to work with that, that all trainings are not possible. But if we are able to develop some steadiness, we're able to remain in awareness, then it's not futile. Verse 17 refers to the final paramita, wisdom, the final chapter and the final paramita. So the chapter is titled Wisdom and the paramita is the paramita of prajna. Henry, could you read verse 17?
All those who fail to understand the secret of the mind, the greatest of all things, although they wish for joy and sorrow's end, will wander to no purpose, uselessly.
Okay, so the secret of the mind, the greatest of all things, in the previous translation that Pema's book relies on, talk about the peak of Dharma, is coming to realize, coming to recognize, mind's luminous, empty nature. The nature of the mind is awareness, emptiness. And it's recognizing the suchness of all experience, seeing through our mistaken views of solid self and solid other that result from what happens when we get caught up in solid dualistic concepts and fixations. And that this, again, we won't be able to develop this prajna without being able to, first of all, rest in awareness, recognize awareness, and come back over and over again. So again, this is the theme of chapter 9, the wisdom chapter. But in little ways, it comes up in other chapters as well. For instance, last week, we verse 47 in the chapter on carefulness. I would try to go back, but I'm really afraid of having trouble with the screen share. But I'll read it. Defilements are not in the object, nor within the faculties, nor somewhere in between. And if not elsewhere, where is their abode? Whence they inflict their havoc on the world. They are simple mirages, and so take heart. This is referring to ultimately to the emptiness of the kleshas. That, for instance, when we experience a moment of aggression, or for that moment of passion, or whatever it might be, that the defilement isn't in what we're perceiving. And we know that's true because even though we may see another person a certain way, other people don't. If it was in that person, everybody would see that person in the same way. When it's said that it's not within the faculties, it's talking about, for instance, both the eye consciousness, what we see, or it could be what we hear, as well as the mental faculty, what we think. If it were in one of those, then we would always see, feel, think in the same way, and we don't. So what actually happens is when we experience a klesha, it's a coming together of causes and conditions. And causes and conditions, as we know, change. They come and go. And it's that lack of solid substance to things, there's no enduring substance, no permanence. That's what we begin to discover and really work with in chapter 9 with wisdom. And with that, we become less bound to our fixations and less caught up in attachment. So ultimately, that's, the prajna paramita is really what ultimately makes all of the paramitas transcendent. But the point is that things come together and come apart through causes and conditions, but they have no real solid substance. As it says in verse 47 in the carefulness chapter, they're simple mirages. And so take heart, banish all your fears, and strive to know their nature. Why suffer needlessly the pains of hell? The next set of verses really focus on the need to keep watch over the mind, although that's really been a topic all along, but it's going to be the conclusion that we come to through the verses that we've studied so far. That all harm comes from the mind and the possibility of all virtue comes from the mind. So at this point, before we begin with verses 18 onward, I'd suggest that maybe we should just take a moment to take a good posture and actually practice what we're going to be working with here. So take a good posture, straight back. And take a moment just to settle into our bodies, become present with ourselves. Slow down, settle. And for the purposes of this, we could just work with the breath, particularly the out breath, which, as we said, is always now and connects naturally with relaxing, letting go. And if thoughts and feelings arise, we just let them come and go as they will. Let them come through without interfering, without judging. And just return our attention to the breath if we become distracted. Out breath, dissolve, let go, just as we do. Okay, thank you. So again, beginning with verse 18, we'll do it again. Shantideva will again talk about how important it is that we keep watch over the mind. With verses 18 through 20, Pema makes the point that in these verses, he's talking about the fact that there's no need to be harsh with ourselves through austerities, that we can take hold of our mind just by simply resting in simplicity, gentleness, present awareness, but that it's important to guard the mind, and that we need to recognize what might be bad company for us. We need to be able to recognize how we become distracted through sense impressions, through engaging with thoughts and judgments. And both talks about this as a reality, being in a wild and unruly crowd, as well as, again, thinking of a wild, unruly crowd as kind of a metaphor for being in challenging circumstances. That we can, one way of understanding what we do in formal meditation practice is we make it very easy for us, or easier, I should say, easier for us to recognize awareness by not engaging in other activities, by taking a good posture and settling into stillness of body. But that in post-meditation, we're involved in activities, we're involved in doing things. So it is more challenging to remain in awareness, but we can train ourselves to do it. And we do this by over and over habituating ourselves, becoming familiar with being in awareness through sitting meditation practice. So, Mark, could you read verses 18 through 20?
Okay.
Thank you.
Therefore, I will take in hand and well protect this mind of mine. What use to me are many disciplines if I can't guard and discipline my mind? When in wild, unruly crowds, I'm careful and attentive of my wounds. Likewise, when in evil company, this wound, my mind, I'll constantly protect. For if I carefully protect my wounds because I fear the pain of minor injuries, why should I not protect the wound that is my mind? For fear of being crushed beneath the cliffs of hell.
So again, he's really just pointing us with some straightforward logic. If we come to understand how all harm comes from the mind, how all virtue comes from the mind, if we come to understand that the untamed mind, the tremendous harm for us that the untamed mind can be, worse than the harm that the most powerful beast, the elephant, can cause to us, why wouldn't we want to protect this mind of ours? As he says, what use to me are many disciplines if I can't guard and discipline my mind? And he compares it to how carefully we'd be if we had like a wound in our body and we didn't want to be bumped or pushed in a crowd. But in the same way, we need to protect our mind. In fact, from his, I would think he would even say that it's even more important to protect the mind. Verses 21 to 22 continue with this point about learning to work with the mind itself, that we have a tendency to externalize the mind's activity, that we'll see temptation, we'll see aggression, we'll see threat in things in the world around us without realizing that we're projecting intentions and beliefs onto the things around us. And that this was what happens when we're not aware of what's going on in our minds. So if you could read, let's see. I'm not sure that I see everybody who has their hands up. So I'm not meaning to exclude anyone. And maybe it would be better if someone else called on people to read. Someone would do that. Okay, thank you. All right, so if someone could read verses 21 and 22.
Trip.
If this is how I act and live, then even in the midst of evil folk, or even with fair women, all is well. My steady keeping of the vows will not decline. My property, my honor, all can freely go, my body and my livelihood as well, and even other virtues may decline, but never will I let my mind regress.
So again, it's just again and again, it comes back to the point that there is nothing that will have such an impact on our lives as being able to develop the discipline of meditation practice. That through that we'll be able to keep our vows, and that even if other virtues decline, that we will not let my mind regress. That this is again the most important thing in protecting our bodhicitta. Beginning with verse 23, Pema says that having made the case of the importance of taming the mind, he begs us to do so. When in this verse, when he says, "I join my hands beseeching you," he's asking us, his audience at the time, but we could hear him calling to us over the centuries, that we could consider and should consider doing the same thing. So if someone else could read verse 23.
Steve.
All you who would protect your minds, maintain your mindfulness and introspection. Guard them both at cost of life and limb. I join my hands beseeching you.
Okay. So in Pema's commentary, she talks about mindfulness and introspection as that at this point he's beginning to instruct us also in what we should be doing or how we could approach this practice. She says that mindfulness and introspection refer to Trenpa and Shashin. So Trenpa is a Tibetan word, Tibetan word, I believe, that it can be translated as mindfulness. Sometimes it's literally translated as recollection. Again, as we talked about before, that we remember to stay present. We remember, and we place our mind on an object of some kind as a way of reminding ourselves over and over again. Simply stay present. And again, the object could be the breath, it could be a visual object, it could be whatever it is that we choose to work with. But they're a means to an end, you could say, or a stepping stone to being able to be in awareness. Shashin is it's really the beginning of awareness. It's what ultimately matures into Vipassana. But from the point of view of shamatha practice, mindfulness practice, Shashin refers to if Trempa is remembering the object, Shashin is what tells us whether we're doing that or not. It's awareness of where our mind is. So with Trempo, we put our mind on an object like the breath or whatever, Shashin, that tells us whether we're doing that or not. And when we realize we're not, we just simply begin again. We come back and we do that over and over again. Another way to describe Shashin is its mind's ability to know what's happening, its mind's ability to know whether we're present or not. And sometimes it's translated as alertness as well, by the way. It's what ultimately does mature into Vipassana, which is a greater awareness of our entire environment. But from the point of view of just shamatha meditation, with Trempa, remembering to be present, and Shashin, which tells us whether or not we're doing that. And again, he beseeches us to cultivate mindfulness, that without being present, we'll never recognize what's happening in our mind. And when we're triggered, we'll just give in to anger, lust, ignorance, and so on. Okay, verse 24. Could somebody read that?
Those disabled by ill health are helpless, powerless to act. The mind, when likewise cramped by ignorance, is impotent and cannot do its work.
Okay, so here Pema says that he's comparing the ignorant mind to being being ill and powerless, having a sickness. And she points out that there are two types of ignorance. One is just a basic misperception of reality that begins with the illusion of a duality of self and other. And she points out that this is so ingrained that we take it for granted, but the misperception of separateness sets off the tension between self and other that leads to solid concepts of all kinds, good, bad, want, don't want. And with that, we end up into the second type of ignorance, which relates to the kleshas, the ignorance of the kleshas. And it's this ignorance that obscures and covers the true nature of our pristine mind. That without a clear and stable mind, we live a fear-based life so controlled by our emotions that we don't know what's going on. So, and again, he compares this to like an illness. And at that point, the mind can't do its work. So again, we come back again and again to the importance of working to tame the mind, working with meditation practice, working to develop our ability to remain in awareness. Somebody could read verses 25 and 26.
Judith.
Sure. For those who have no introspection, though they hear the teachings, ponder them, or meditate, like water seeping from a leaking jar, their learning will not settle in their memories. Many are endowed with joyful diligence. They're learned also and imbued with faith, but through the fault of lacking introspection, they will not escape the stain of sin and downfall.
So again,
okay, is that it?
That's it. Thank you. So again, it's been pointed out to us how a distracted, unsettled, confused, driven mind keeps us imprisoned and unable to hear or benefit from the teachings. Particularly in the commentary by Kungzhen Palden, he says verse 25 in particular refers to the inability to engage in the three prajnas, the inability to hear, contemplate, and meditate. Because again, we're so distracted that we never are able to first hear enough to understand the teachings. Secondly, we're unable to contemplate them, which means both coming to an understanding for ourselves what sense they make, but just perhaps more importantly, making a personal connection, seeing how what's described in the teachings and what seems to be out there as an idea relates to our lives, relates to what we actually directly can experience if we have the clarity to see it. And then meditation practice, where we actually meditate on those things. That without that, it's like water seeping from a leaking jar. And similarly, even if we have some kind of diligence, but if we're not able to, again, develop some steadiness of mind, we won't escape the stain of sin and downfall, because again and again, we'll give in to the kleshas. Could someone read verses 27 and 28?
Henry.
Lack of introspection is a thief. It slinks behind when mindfulness abates, and all the merit we have gathered in, it steals, and down we go to lower realms. Defilements are a band of robbers looking for their chance to injure us. They steal our virtue when their moment comes and batter out the lives of happy destinies.
So we can look at our own experience and decide if this is true or not. But the basic idea is that so long as the mind is unsettled, distracted, as long as we become absorbed in thoughts and feelings in a mindless way, that we're constantly vulnerable to the defilements, like a band of robbers waiting to attack us. So this brings us to his conclusion of what we'll do, and begins to really get into with verse 29, how to practice mindfulness. So that will be the theme for verses 29 through 33. So begin with someone reading verse 29.
Philip. Therefore, from the gateway of my mind, my mindfulness shall not have leave to stray. And if it wanders, it shall be recalled by thoughts of anguish in the lower worlds.
Okay, so the gateway of the mind refers to, I should have looked this up too, either refers to the ayatanas or dhatus, but basically it's talking about the sense faculties, sight, sound, smell, touch, taste, and body sensations, as well as the mental consciousness. And the idea is these are the gateways of the mind. And the point is that whatever we see, hear, smell, touch, taste, whatever thoughts and feelings, whatever object of mind we might experience, we should meet with awareness. That's really what he's saying here. And Pema says this refers to our growing understanding of what truly helps and harms us. We begin to really have a sense of what it is, what to accept and what to reject, what brings misery and what brings happiness. And that this happens not by looking to the external world for some kind of refuge, and for not externalizing the kleshas as real. That when we see the mind get stuck in notions of for or against or some seductive fantasy, we recall how much pain was caused by getting swept away in the past, and we gently return to the present. These are the lines, if it wanders, it shall be recalled by thoughts of anguish in the lower realms. That's specifically what she's referring to. As soon as we see we're hooked, she says, we can let go of the storyline and return to the immediacy of our experience. Can someone read verses 30 through 32?
Mark.
Hi, okay. Through fear and by the counsels of their abbots, and staying ever in their teachers' company, in those endowed with fortune and devotion, mindfulness is cultivated easily. The Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas both possess unclouded vision, seeing everything. All lies open to their gaze, and likewise I am always in their presence. One who has such thoughts as these will gain devotion with a sense of fear and shame. For such a one, the memory of Buddha rising frequently before the mind.
So these three verses refer to how we can work with the practice, and that it begins with some sense of devotion and appreciation of teachers and the teachings. We can have some appreciation for Shantideva and the clarity of this text, have appreciation of Trungpa Rinpoche and his teachings, or any other teacher that we might have experienced. I had some experience of. But the point is to have appreciation and devotion to the teachings and the teacher, and that this makes it easier for us to cultivate mindfulness, because we come to realize that we've been presented with something quite precious and powerful. I wanted to just say something very quickly about the sense of fear and shame, because Pema comments on this as well. That first of all, fear, this doesn't mean that we should live in a state of constant anxiety, but it's rather more that what we develop through our study and practice is a very real understanding of the danger of the kleshas, so that it's not based on just some general sense of being afraid of some external judge or someone who, something that's outside of us that's going to get us. It's more that we have a pretty clear understanding, or we develop a clearer understanding of cause and effect, and don't want to give in to the kleshas. In other words, it's a sense of realistic perception based on clarity and understanding, and also by looking at personal experience and contemplation of the teachings. And Pema makes the point that in talking about shame, she's not talking about self-denigration, but more a sense of positive shame, that a sense of I can and will do better, that I regret harmful actions, I'll learn from my experiences, both good and bad. But again, that it's not a view of basic badness, which actually is a tremendous obstacle to the teachings, but more just a sense that I can do better and I will do better, and I regret actions that have caused harm to myself and others. Someone read verse 33.
Lodro.
When mindfulness is stationed as a sentinel, a guard upon the threshold of the mind, introspection will be likewise there, returning when forgotten or dispersed.
Okay, so here we come to it. When we practice meditation, we're choosing to be awake. Mindfulness is the sentinel who notices if we've wandered off. And again, as Pema says, this isn't a harsh or judgmental guard, but we could really think of it as more of a protector. But the point is that we have a choice about our mind and conduct if we're awake, if we're aware of what we're feeling, aware of what we're experiencing. And that we can see when we start to get lost, when we start to get confused, when we start to get distracted, that we can come back. And we just do this over and over again. The next set of verses relate to particularly the discipline of avoiding negativity, according to Kunzang Palden. So begin with, if somebody could read verse 34.
True.
If at the outset, when I check my mind, I find that it is tainted with some fault, I shall be still and self-possessed, unmoving like a piece of wood.
So again, they're not talking about doing any kind of deep analysis. It's just that if we settle in awareness, we know. We know when we're starting to become angry. We know when we're starting to get, carried away with, passion or a desire of some kind. We know when we're thick with ignorance. And what he's saying is that if we see that this is happening, then we should be still and self-possessed, unmoving like a piece of wood, which I'll talk about in a moment. Pema relates this particular verse to the two main obstacles to meditation practice, which you could read about in the Profound Treasury, the Path of Individual Liberation, but particularly the two obstacles of meditation that are wildness and drowsiness, or sometimes called wildness and dullness. And she, talks about some of the different things we can do when we recognize that we're in a drowsy and dull state of mind, to kind of perk ourselves up, maybe raise our gaze, stretch, check posture if we're slumped. And if we're giving into wildness or some kind of excitation, we're getting just carried away with whatever we're feeling, that maybe we can lower our gaze a bit. We can settle and relax into body. That we can, we may be, sometimes wildness comes out of trying to be too tight in our technique, tying ourselves up too much in technique. So maybe relaxing even technique a little bit. Again, you can read those chapters on the obstacles and antidotes to meditation practice in the Path of Individual Liberation. But Pema connects that to this particular thing in terms of recognizing a fault in the mind. But if our state of mind, Kunzang Palden more talks about anything that we might notice in our state of mind that we realize can lead to harm. That if our state of mind is negative, we should be unmoving like a piece of wood, which means we should just stop and see, not be still and self-possessed. This notion of being like a piece of wood or like a log will come up repeatedly in verses 48 to 53, like a log remain. The idea is not to give in to the impulse, not to... if we're already have an angry thought, not to then follow that with another angry thought or another desirous thought, another attached thought, another clinging thought, whatever it might be. So we don't give in to the more impulsive nature of mind, which reminded me of one talk I heard Trungpa Rinpoche gave, where somebody asked him about what's the difference between impulsiveness and spontaneity. And his answer was that impulsiveness involves tension, that there's a kind of a sense of needing to release something. Whereas spontaneity, there's a sense of play and freedom and creativity, and there isn't that sense of tension. So we can notice the difference and not give in to kind of the impulsive giving in to one thought after another thought, working ourselves up. To a state of anger or wildness or distraction. Okay, so verses 35 and 36, Pema says our advice for when we're out and about. So it's more clearly related to post-meditation experience. If someone could read verses 35 and 36.
Shani.
I shall never vacantly allow my gaze to wander all around, but rather with a focused mind will always go with eyes cast down. But that I may relax my gaze, I'll sometimes raise my eyes and look around. And if there are some people standing in my sight, I'll look at them and greet them with a friendly word.
Okay, so Pema talks about these two verses in terms of just being able to see again where and how we get distracted, what it is that causes us to begin to lose our mindfulness. The idea of being out and about in a crowd, I thought like maybe if Shantideva were alive today, he might talk about what happens when we engage with social media and all the temptation to, particularly in some social media, to give in to the kind of clickbait things you'll see that are meant to invite some sense of anger or resentment or envy or some kind of judgment about somebody or something, and that we shouldn't allow ourselves to do that. We should recognize what's happening and let go, rather than continue to engage in that kind of thinking. Verses 37 through 39 relate to awareness of the body and and the environment. And in particular, Pema says verse 39 relates to mindfulness of body. So if someone could read verses 37 through 39.
Philip. Sorry. And yet, to spy the dangers on the road, I'll scrutinize the four directions one by one. And when I stop to rest, I'll turn my head and look behind me, back along my path. And so I'll spy the land in front, behind, to see if I should go or else return. And thus, in every situation, I shall know my needs and act accordingly. Deciding on a given course, determining the actions of my body, from time to time, I'll verify my body's actions by repeated scrutiny.
Okay, so here again, we're talking about, he's talking about the importance of having some awareness to the environment. Pema says the point is not to be distracted by our conditioned responses, but to see clearly what needs to be done and act accordingly. Or as the verse says, I'll know my needs and act accordingly. And that with verse 39 in particular, again, she relates this to mindfulness of body. She says we could take a fresh look at body without being critical or proud, but just pay attention to what we're doing. Again, this is exactly what we practice in sitting and walking meditation, just learning to be present, with whatever we're doing. Pema also says that beginning with verse 40, we're talking verses 40 through 47, that we're talking about training in mindfulness of mind. So again, if someone could read verse 40.
Lojo.
This rampant elephant, my mind, once tied to that great post, reflection on the teachings, must now be watched with all of my strength, that it might never slip away.
Okay, so again, we're developing mindfulness, being able to be aware, remain in awareness, stay in awareness in every moment. And part of this, one of the things that helps us with that, as Pema says, is reflection on the teachings. And this could really be anything related to the teachings. It could be a contemplation of the suffering brought on by the kleshas. It could be contemplation of cause and effect. The point is, when we realize when we're hooked, when we realize that we're struggling with distracted mind, klesha mind, that it's helpful to teach ourselves the Dharma, to contemplate the Dharma, and look at, again, what seems to be true to our actual experience. Would someone read verses 41 to 42, please?
Every.
Those who strive to master concentration should never for an instant be distracted. They should always watch their minds, inquiring, where is now my mind engaged? When this becomes impossible, in case of danger or festivity, I'll act as it seems best, for it is taught that rules of discipline may be relaxed in times of generosity.
So Pema connects these two verses to the instruction to not to be too loose and not to be too tight. The first one is a warning about not being too loose, and the second being not too tight. That we maintain an awareness of how our mind is engaged, but at the same time we don't become so tight with that we're not able to respond to danger or engage in festivity. that at those times we act as it seems best. And that by simply being present, we can relate to what actually is appropriate to the situation. Could someone read verses 43 and 44?
Steve.
When something has been planned and started on, attention should not drift to other things. With thoughts fixed on the chosen target, that and that alone should be pursued. Behaving in this way, all tasks are well performed, and nothing is achieved by doing otherwise. If thus we act, the secondary defilement, lack of introspection, will not grow.
So here he's talking about just remaining mindful with whatever activity we're doing. And that we can just, again, it's that we can just engage with simple mindfulness awareness with whatever activity we're doing. That when our attention drifts, we won't complete things. We'll just, we'll find our efforts scattered. But if we are able to stay steady, remain in awareness, then we're able to see that all tasks are well performed. And that if we're able to do this, if we're able to stay in this, basic mindfulness, then lack of introspection will not grow. We'll be aware of where our mind is and what we're doing. I was trying to find this section in Trungpa Rinpoche's Path of Individual Liberation, or he says something like that when we become mindless, when we're lacking awareness, that we become clumsy and awkward in our actions and end up making mistakes and causing trouble for ourselves. Not even necessarily great harm, just not doing a great job of things. And that's precisely what Shantideva is talking about here. That with just simple mindfulness awareness, just simply being present, that we can do a good job with things. 45 through 47, verses 45 through 47 relate to situations where maybe we find ourselves distracted, where we find ourselves absorbed mindlessly in pleasures or lost in mindless activities. And the instruction is when we see that, when we recognize that's happening, we come back. Again, just like what we do in meditation practice. When we realize we've become distracted, we note it, and we allow ourselves to come back. So could somebody read verses 45 through 47?
Lodro.
And if you find yourself engaged in different kinds of pointless conversation and curious sights, the like of which abound, be rid of all delight and taste for them. And if you find you're grubbing in the soil, or pulling up the grass, or tracing idle patterns on the ground, remembering the precepts of the blissful one, in fear, restrain yourself at once. And when you feel the wish to move about, or even to express yourself in speech, first examine what is in your mind, for steadfast ones should act correctly.
So again, when we see that we're experiencing thoughts and feelings that are distracting us, as Pema says, we can acknowledge the tug, the hook, and let go and come back to taming the mind. That we can look again and again at our intentions and motivations, which is what he means by examine the mind. Okay, verses 48 through 53 relate to verses 48 through 53 is where Shantideva begins talking directly about the first of the three types of discipline, which is not causing harm. The other two types of discipline are gathering virtue and benefiting beings, and that's what's covered in the last half of the chapter that we'll be talking about next week. So beginning with verse 48, he'll be talking about a number of different situations where different kinds of klesha activity could arise in our mind. And again, the important point is to recognize that and not give in to the urge to cause harm. Kunzo Paulsen actually counts that there are 27 situations where essentially we could lose it. Our actions, Pema talks about them in some cases as actions that we take to fortify ego, to put ourselves first, and to, to disregard potential harm to others. So we'll go through these now. We begin with, somebody could read 48 through 50.
Trip.
When the urge arises in your mind to feelings of desire or angry hate, do not act, be silent, do not speak, and like a log of wood, be sure to stay. And when your mind is wild or filled with mockery, or filled with pride and haughty arrogance, or when you would expect another secret guilt, expose another secret guilt, to bring up old dissensions or to act deceitfully, or when you want to fish for praise or criticize and spoil another's name, or use harsh language, sparring for a fight, it's then that like a log you should remain.
So again, what's important here is that we know what's happening in our mind, that we're in awareness and we recognize what we're thinking, what we're feeling, what our intentions are, that we're not just blindly or impulsively giving in and following one thought with another, building up steam to the point where we act out in some way. So being like a log is an interesting metaphor, and it comes up again in a few more verses. And I think it's important to understand that he's not talking about repressing what we're experiencing, but he's talking about not giving into it. We're not acting out either. Being like a log is just, not acting further on the next thought, not following one thought with another, and letting thoughts lead to action. So we blurt out something harmful. We don't swing out at somebody in anger, or we don't act out in lust or blind passion or ignorance. The point is we want to turn down the heat before we get too carried away. But it's not repression, although, and it also depends on what we're able to do. If all we can do is just stop ourselves, then that's better than giving in and actually acting out kleshas, actually acting out and doing things that would cause harm to another person. But again, the point isn't so much to push anything away. It's just to not act on it, to be able to just not engage further with it and just see it for what it is as best we can. Needless to say, this can be very challenging, but that's what we're asked to do. Could someone read verses 51 through 53?
Steve. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry about that. And when you yearn for wealth, attention, fame, a circle of retainers serving you, and when you look for honors, recognition, it's then that, like a log, you should remain. And when you are inclined to overlook another's need and want to get the best thing for yourself, and when you feel the urge to speak, and it's then that, like a log, you should remain. Impatience, indolence, faint-heartedness, and likewise arrogance and careless speech attached to your side, when these arise, it's then that, like a log, you should remain.
So again, in some cases, these Pema points out that these are different ways in which we try to fortify ourselves, solidify ego, and again, overlook another's need, look for the best for ourselves, put ourselves first rather than considering other beings. That all these things we need to recognize, and if we recognize that that's what's happening, like a log, we should remain, not act further on it, not go further with it. Pema in all of these cases. So again, Kunzig Palden counts, says there are actually 27 different situations that are presented here, ending with arrogance, careless speech, and attachment to our side. Pema points out that there are different ways in which we can catch ourselves before we get carried away. And she says there are 4 places of opportunity to do this. The first is it begins with just whatever initial perception we have that gives rise to a sense of comfort or discomfort. She calls this a subtle level of Shenpa, that we can recognize just the beginning of getting hooked by passion, aggression, or ignorance. And that when that happens, if we can just stay in direct experience and just let emotion run through us without getting stuck. As she says, this is not easy and takes practice. At the second point, she says, with this point, thoughts begin to build up, but they don't have a real momentum yet. We can interrupt our thoughts. We can do simple things just to cool ourselves out, bring down the heat, you could say. We might take deep breaths. We might look away. We might remind ourselves to just stay calm. Remind ourselves to just stay awake, stay aware. The third point is when emotions begin to escalate. So we've gone from perception to thought to emotion really beginning to escalate. And she says we might recognize this. And the important thing here is to let the storyline go, or at least be able to question it. And the fourth point is just before the fatal step, just when we actually act out, we actually say, engage in some kind of harsh or critical speech, or we actually lash out and are physically aggressive or destructive, or if it's passion that we, actually, attempt to take possession or cling to whatever it is that we're passionate about. We act on passion or lust. And she says, this is just before that point. And as she says, maybe the best we can do is exactly what he says. Do not act, be silent, do not speak. And she points out that paradoxically, in some ways, this is the easiest place to notice because the intensity is so great, but it can be the hardest to refrain from. It's the point where we're just about to lose our seat. And the point is we can come back, we can regain our balance, we can take a deep breath and just begin again. In thinking about her, the four opportunities to, again, bring ourselves back, not engage in negativity, which is the point of all these verses 48 through 53, where it's like a log we should remain, really reminded me of training when I was working, again, in the school, the special education school that I work with. Because one of the hardest things, and not for all staff, including myself, was not getting caught up in power struggles with kids. And really being clear about catching myself or other people catching themselves when they started to escalate. And, sometimes it's easy, so what if, a kid wants to do his homework in crayon rather than pencil, even though you can't really erase crayon if you want to, change a mistake. But then there are times when there are things where you have to stop. I want to run out on the road and get hit by a car. So you have to find ways to stay present, stay calm, and not get into a power struggle, because that just escalates a person's emotionality further. So this really, anyway, I'm just saying this part really resonated for me, that sense of awareness, that sense of recognition, that sense of introspection, examining the mind and seeing knowing how we're feeling, how we're acting, what we're doing, so that we don't let the situation run away with us. In any case, he sums up the chapter with verse 54, so if someone could read that.
How about Shani?
Examine thus yourself on every side. Take note of your defilements and your pointless efforts. For thus the heroes on the Bodhisattva path seize firmly on such faults with proper remedies.
Okay, so this is how he ends this section on not causing harm to others. As I say, the remaining half of the chapter covers the other two aspects of discipline, gathering virtue and benefiting beings. But again, the important thing here is to note when we're giving in to the kleshas, and also to see where the part about pointless efforts is coming to understand how distraction, a scattered mind, as we heard about earlier in the chapter, make it impossible for us to develop the paramitas. And as he says, for heroes on the Bodhisattva path, we should seizely firm on such faults with proper remedies. So with that, we'll end the screen share. And I guess we have just a couple minutes, but if there's any comments or questions that people have, we could do that. I also should say that I won't be here for discussion group tomorrow night. I'm sorry, I have something else that I'll be engaged in. But other people will be here, so if you do want to ask questions of me, here's your only chance. Mark?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Sorry to. I just are there any tools we can use, because that really resonates. Well, I guess for all of us. So well, I know I get so crazy sometimes when something happens on the road or whatever. Is there any kind of tools besides the teachings, like where we kind of, I don't know, maybe scream at each other? I don't know. Okay.
The anger management. I sometimes can be pretty unreasonable as a driver too. The first thing is just what he says. It's recognizing what's happening, seeing what's happening. And then, as Pema said, reflection on the teachings. Remember that, we can rest in awareness. We might need to do something just to work with the energy that we're experiencing. Every emotion is, there's a lot of energy with emotion. And that's why, anything that helps us just, get a grip on the energy that's, that we might be experiencing, deep breaths, tension, there's all kinds of, relaxation techniques that have been developed, like tensing up and loosening, like your hands or something. And, but you have to find what works for you. But the critical thing is recognizing what's going on. It's being in awareness. And that we develop through our meditation practice and by being open to awareness when it occurs to us in post-meditation, rather than running away from it.
Thank you. I just have, it's just the timing issue with like, if I can give myself 5 seconds instead of reacting so quickly, that's the problem I have. I just get so caught up in it so quickly that it's too late. I've already screamed my expletive. Anyway.
If there's nobody else around, it's maybe not so bad. But some people are noting in the chat about Pema's book. Let me see what it was. Don't Bite the Hook. I have not read that, but it sounds good.
All right. Maybe I'll try to read that.
But otherwise, it's, we can look, it helps to, again, to be in awareness. It also helps sometimes to look at what we are thinking and see if there's a pattern to our thoughts, that, if we're always saying the same things to ourselves, then, maybe we can be able to let go of that or question that. The chapter on patience has a whole lot about this, but the first thing is not giving in and recognizing. Then we can do things. We can analyze. We can look at our thoughts. We can look at other ways that we might understand the situation, which, again, this is a lot of what's, what we'll be reading about in chapter 6, which I think is a great chapter.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Going once, going twice. Their hand's still up, but I think that's
yeah, that's just residual.
From reading.
We're out of time, really.
Yeah, so we are. All right. I will put up the closing chant then, and I'll mute us all and Trip on mute.
We will close by saying a prayer for peace and dedicating the merit earned by our practice for the benefit of all sentient beings. By the blessings of enlightened and compassionate ones, by the power of my positive actions of 3 times and my prayers of pure aspiration, may wars, conflicts, epidemics, and all other maladies dissolve in this world, and may the earth and all who live on this earth enjoy the abundance of well-being. May all learn to live lovingly with each other. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience, may defeat the enemy, wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great east, may the lotus garden of the Rigdon's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory.
Thank you, Michael. That was wonderful.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Barry.
Thank you,
Yes,
Michael.
thank you, Michael. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Michael.
Michael.
Thank
It's really
you.
helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.
Night, everybody.
Bye, Michael.
Yes.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Oh.